From Fox 8 Sports, this is the Overtime Podcast.
From the Fox 8 studios in Newport Beach, California, this is the Fox 8 Overtime Podcast. I'm Andre Johnson Jr. That's Sean Fazende on the other side of the screen. And before we get into things, make sure to like, share, rate, review. And if you're watching on YouTube, please hit that little bell below. Get that ding notification every time we post a new podcast so you don't miss any of this fire content. Sean, you got some mountains behind you. You're off the beach. You got a new location. What's going on out there?
Yeah. Got a new location. Got a little bit of a weather issue out here. The wind's blowing pretty thick. It's messing my hair up a little bit. Other than that, everything's all good. I understand y'all having some issues down there in New Orleans with some. There goes that wind with the heat down there. So you stay safe. We'll stay safe out here. I only got a few more days out here on the West Coast.
I'm sure you'll miss it so much.
It's been fantastic. It's been a good time. So here we are.
Yeah, you know, we're coming off a pretty big weekend. The Saints playing their first preseason game. We learned a little bit in that game, but today our big picture is going to be what's the realest thing that we took away from the Saints win over the Arizona Cardinals. Sean, you were there in Phoenix, and what's your biggest takeaway from that game?
Yeah, there's so many layers when you watch a preseason game, and it's not always easy to figure out what you're looking at, if it's real, if it's preseason fool's gold, is it more of an evaluation thing? So there's the evaluation aspect of, okay, who's the best players that you can get on your roster to help you win once the regular season starts. And then there's this other area where you look at what you've seen throughout at that point it was 13 practices. Now they've had 15 practices. 13 practices, what you've seen on the field, and was it a case of, is that side of the ball, or is this group that good? Or are they catching the other side's tendencies because they're going up against each other for 13 days? And sometimes a preseason game can help solidify that. So, with that being said, the most important thing that I saw, the realest thing that I saw, was first-team defense. First-team defense was outstanding. You saw it, 3 straight 3-and-outs. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. We all know they didn't have their starting quarterback. I don't know how many starting offensive linemen they had playing. So I don't want to go too far into that. But I do think what we saw Saturday night in Arizona has been exactly what we've seen through 13 practices out here at UC Irvine for the Saints. That front 7 now, not just front 4. That front 7 has been very active. The Saints have got a lot invested up front. I mean, you talk about Chase Young, you talk about Peyton Turner, you talk about Granderson, who they paid, Cam Jordan, obviously, Brian Brzee, first-round pick. They were getting after the quarterback, down in and down out. I mean, the line of scrimmage was won by the Saints defense. And you go one layer back or one level back, and you have the linebackers. You saw Willie Gay. Right. He's making great plays. Now, again, wasn't all first-teamers. We understand that. But when you talk about what we saw in practice, what transferred the most, that can potentially transfer to the regular season. That's it. It's the first-team defense. And it's how far do you go in terms of projecting what this defense can be. What I am okay with now in saying is this is going to be a good defense, or potential to be a good defense. They don't want to just be good, though. I mean, they want this to be a great top 5, top 2, top 1 defense, and they have a lot invested in there to get to that point. It's always felt like it was a little bit of underachieving when you talk about what you put in versus what you've actually gotten out of that defense, in particular the front 7, like I'm talking about. So it is good. It is it's good to see that that what they've put the investment in is actually working out, and it is good to see. Okay, we saw this for 13 practices, and that's the first thing we saw in the first preseason, and that's certainly a good thing. It's only one step. We understand that. There's still a long way to go, and there's always factors you can't control, health being one of them. But for the first preseason game, and there were a lot of things we could talk about with that first preseason game, the most tangible thing, the most important thing, the realest thing, the one that gives me the most, call it hope or reason to be optimistic, was that first-team defense and the way they attacked the Cardinals. It wasn't the entire first-team offense, but the Cardinals, call it starters in that game.
Definitely, and I mean, they really impressed at every level, Sean. When you look at the pass rush, you had Carl Granderson with a sack. You had Brian Brzee get into the action. Some guys like Nico Lalos and Jack Heflin get into the action. And a guy who you really didn't get to see early in the offseason, who has really kind of come on during training camp, Kool-Aid McKinstry looked good. Kool-Aid McKinstry had some moments. You saw Willie Gay Jr., the big free agent acquisition. Willie Gay Jr. had some key stops. He had a tackle for loss. But what stood out to me may not be what stood out to a lot of people, but I think long term it may be important. And that's two guys who you may not have heard of if you're a Saints fan, and that's Rajon Wright and Rico Payton. Both of those two have played incredible in that first game. You've kind of seen them make some big pass breakups throughout training camp, and it sticks out to me because at this point of the year, not many people have heard of them. But at this point in the year, last year, I'm pretty sure not many people had heard of a cornerback by the name of Isaac Yiadom. Isaac Yiadom wound up being one of the best cornerbacks for the Saints last season. So this time of the year, preseason, that's kind of who I'm looking at. The guys who we don't know who can potentially step up and play a relevant role on this defense, and especially in that secondary, which looks to be one of the strongest secondaries in the entire NFL right now.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually asked about both those guys on a radio show I was on earlier. And that's more of the evaluation aspect of the preseason. Okay, who is good enough to get those last few roster spots? Both those guys actually helped their causes. Peyton made another play today at practice, and Rajon Wright picked off Spencer Rattler today in practice. A really nice play where he cut in front of a ball to Dallin Holker. So I don't know how the numbers are going to shake out of that cornerback room. In that DB room, there's a lot of bodies there. They have a lot of investment there. They have a few guys banged up, which is why these guys are getting more opportunities to get snaps on the football field, both in preseason game and in the practices that we've seen, and that's certainly a good thing. Shamar John Charles hasn't been terrible either. He's actually had some nice moments as well. I just wonder how that room is going to shake out from a numbers standpoint, because there's a lot of high-end investment there. Have those guys done enough? Can they do enough to sneak on that roster, maybe be the 52nd, 53rd player to make the roster? I'll say this, though. If they want to, it's got to be through special teams. They've got to be able to contribute on special teams.
I agree. And now one area we've talked about the corners and everything, but while we're talking about that defense, Sean, Dennis Allen said something interesting today at practice. He was asked about the safety battle. And he specifically said that outside of Tyrann Mathieu, who you kind of expect to stand out because he's a veteran, nobody's really stood out in the battle to see who that other safety on the other side is going to be. And we know they had Justin Simmons, the Pro Bowler and All-Pro visit last week. But that other safety spot, that's really kind of starting to be the biggest question mark for the Saints this offseason.
Yeah, and he's been pretty real about that, hasn't he? I mean, he's basically said none of those guys have stepped up and said this is my job. And that's what he wants to see. He wants somebody to take a hold of that job and be like, no, I'm the guy. You cannot pick anyone else because I'm that much better. I'm doing that much more to earn this spot. Look at the guys that you're involved with in that. You got Jordan Howden, a guy that had a decent rookie season, but by the end of the rookie season, his snaps had kind of diminished a little bit and kind of gave way to Jonathan Abram. You have Jonathan Abram, and you have Will Harris, a guy that can do a lot in the secondary. So I still think, look, D.A. is a defensive guy, and I praise the front, I praise the linebackers, I praise the cornerbacks. Tyrann is always going to be Tyrann. He's going to hit his 3, 4, 5 interceptions a season. He's going to be in the right spot. We know that. Where's the weak link? Right now, I think it's pretty fair to say it's at that other safety spot opposite of Tyrann Mathieu, especially with the way those guys run that defense, and D.A. alluded to it today. There are so many opportunities for the safety position with the way they play the defense in their coverages for pass breakups, interceptions, and even tackles just in the open field. So somebody's got to step up, and I'm a little surprised it's taken this long, but there's a reason why they brought Justin Simmons in for that visit. We'll see what happens with that. I mean, maybe by the time you listen to this, he would have either signed here or somewhere else, but who knows. But nonetheless, I think that's a real vulnerability on this defense, maybe the biggest vulnerability on this defense, maybe the one weak link that DA is worried about.
Right, and Justin Simmons also visiting with Atlanta recently, so it'll be interesting to see who he winds up picking. So now we move from the defense to the offense. You mentioned Spencer Rattler earlier. The Spencer Rattler fan club has been in full effect for the last 3 days. Rattler leading what wound up being a game-winning drive against the Cardinals in the preseason. So now we got to talk about that QB2 battle. Jake Haener, Spencer Rattler, both got around the same amount of time in that first game. Who were you most impressed with? And going into that game, I know you said you felt like Jake Haener had a little bit of a lead. Do you still feel that way?
Okay, I've been trying to kind of conceptualize this based off what I'm seeing in front of me, what I've seen in practices, what I know to be true with this offense, and this is the best I can come up with right now. Hey, it's amazing how much they've kind of mirrored each other in each outing. I mean, they both basically did the same thing in this game when you really think about it. The only difference is Spencer was able to use his legs and get in the end zone with that touchdown run. But they both had 2 scoring drives, both had 2-minute drives. Haener had the crazy drive. It was less than 30 seconds at his own, 15 or something like that. He was able to lead it down. So, look, here's what it boils down to. And I have a feeling people are going to probably take this the wrong way, but I will explain myself. When you talk about overall talent, I think it's pretty obvious. Spencer Rattler has the more overall talent. That's not to say Jake Haener is not talented. That is to say Spencer Rattler is physically more talented. When it comes to execution, not just one preseason game, but the entirety of practices and consistency and the preseason game, I still think a slight lead for Jake Haener. That's not to say Rattler cannot execute this offense. You saw it. He can. But when you're grading it all out over the 15 practices plus 1 preseason game span, that's where I go with it. I think it's pretty clear Spencer Rattler has very good to great arm talent. I think it's very clear that Jake Haener knows and understands this offense and for most of the part knows where to go with the football. That's why I don't think there is a leader right now. I think this is neck and neck because which guy can check the other column that's not necessarily their strength a little bit more to kind of give themselves the final composite score when the preseason comes to an end. I think it's going to be fascinating. It's one of the best battles we've seen all camp. One guy does something, the other guy does something. I talked to Jake Haener after the game. That's a confident guy now. And he said, I think we look pretty good. He was not ashamed to say how he and Rattler both look good in that preseason opener. We'll see what happens Sunday in San Francisco. Maybe they flip it this time where Haener gets the end of the game and Rattler gets the end of the half. Who knows? I know they've been doing kind of the every day, kind of just rotating 2s and 3s. Today Rattler with the 2s, Haener with the 3s. They'll probably flip it tomorrow. So who knows what it actually ends up being once they get to the preseason game. And there's something else here too. I mean, when you have these 2 guys battling it out, legit competition, and they're raising the bar, so to speak, that raises everybody else around them. So now the wide receiver reps look better, the tight end reps look better, the O-line reps look better because you have 2 quarterbacks you can certainly trust that with those 2nd and 3rd team reps, and sometimes in the preseason, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th team reps can get ugly. I mean, we've seen it. It can get ugly, but that hasn't been the case, and that's been really fun to watch. I'm very curious to see how this ends up, sort of adding up and who they end up going with for QB2. I mean, and look, realistically, Derek Carr's QB1, so we wouldn't really, I don't know if they'd have to declare it unless he were to get injured in a game. But nonetheless, I do think that's been a fun competition to watch, probably the best competition to watch all of camp.
Definitely, and like you said, it adds a lot of excitement to the preseason if you're a Saints fan, because how many fans are locked in for 4 quarters of a preseason game? In past years, 3 hours into the first preseason game, you may not be locked into the screen, but when Spencer Rattler was trying to lead that game-winning drive, I know you had a lot of the Who Dat Nation really watching hard to see what would wind up happening. Now, when it comes to Haener versus Rattler, I think the gap between the 2 is exaggerated from that first playoff game because I think a lot of people feel like Rattler did a lot better than Haener. Haener started off slow. He did. He had that one pass that probably should have been picked off early on, but he bounced back. He made a nice throw to A.T. Perry on the sideline. He hit Kevin Austin Jr. on that 4th down to convert on that first scoring drive. He made the best throw of the day, 58 yards down the field to A.T. Perry, the best play of the day, arguably one of the best plays of the entire week, goes to Jake Haener. And like you said, he did lead 2 scoring drives. He led a clutch scoring drive in the last 2 minutes of the half. Haener started off a little rough, but he finished really well. Spencer Rattler, his first drive was good. He showed you that mobility and the talent that you touched on, the fearlessness to pretty much lower his head and take on a defender and get into the end zone. And then he finished things off with another clutch game-winning drive, but it was the in-between that I think is holding Spencer Rattler back. The first drive was good, the last drive was good, but there were a couple of drives in between the first and last drive where Spencer Rattler wasn't exactly on the money. So I think this battle, like you said, is still very much back and forth. It's still very tight. Jake Haener probably has a slight lead because not only do the preseason games matter, the practices matter as well. So we'll see what kind of happens as we head into San Francisco, and then they've got a 3rd game here. So this battle is going to be the focus of Saints training camp and Saints preseason until September, Sean, when that 2nd string quarterback is finally named.
Yeah, I mean, I went back and watched all their reps again today, all the preseason reps. I mean, you said it. I mean, I thought Hayner started off a little slow, and he got a little bit better as the half went on. He had the 2 scoring drives. He had that one miss where he kind of checked it down to Jordan Mims. We had Stanley Morgan open on that crosser. There was another one where he could have possibly had. It was on the end of the first half where he could have possibly had A.T. Perry on a front side dig route there that was coming open. If he threw it to Stanley Morgan in the back of the end zone on the opposite field, that may have been a tough decision. But it's just so rare. You have this sort of a tough battle or a good battle for this position, and you get those 2 set of circumstances come to play in the preseason opener for both guys. So they both got the opportunity, they both took advantage, and they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're making this extremely tough on the coaches to make a decision on who'll be the backup quarterback in 2024.
I agree, Sean. They definitely did that, and it's not just that battle. It's also, wide receiver 3. Has a wide receiver 3 really jumped out so far? We talked about that safety battle and what that's been like. We've seen Willie Gay Jr. play well in the preseason, but Pete Werner's had a great camp. So a lot of the battles that we talked about heading into training camp, we're about, 3 weeks into camp, and there's still no clear front runner for any of them right now.
That's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's something to really watch going forward. I mean, we talked about the safety battle. I think that wide receiver 3, I think A.T. Perry really helped himself, but he left practice early today, which tough break for him, had an ankle sprain, but I thought he did really well. I think he's come on the last few weeks, Perry, with this production. Cedric Wilson's another guy, so I think it might be narrowed down to those 2 guys, Wilson and Perry for wide receiver 3, but I think both those guys make the roster. And then a guy like Bub Means, he was back today in a red jersey. Rasheed Shaheed was back in a red jersey. So we'll see who ultimately plays this Sunday, but still a lot to be determined. I mean, nowhere near a finished product, but I think the overall experience, despite at moments being a little boring, Saturday night, let's be real, before the end of the first half and end of the game was a little boring at times. I think overall it was a positive experience for the first preseason game.
Definitely, Sean. And last thing before we get out of here, there were some special guests today at training camp. Drew Brees, Roman Harper, Scott Fajita, Scott Shanley, Lance Moore, a lot of members from that Super Bowl team showing up today at training camp. And I know you got to talk to Lance Moore for a little bit after practice. What was it like kind of seeing all of those champions and New Orleans legends together? And what kind of role did they have today at practice talking to the current generation of Saints?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was kind of getting a first-hand, up-close and personal look. A lot of those guys are on the West Coast. I know it was Shanley, Fajita, Harper. I know Harper doesn't live on the West Coast, nor does Shanley, but I think Fajita does. Lance Moore, I spoke to him. He lives in San Diego. Drew, of course, lives in San Diego. Who am I missing? There was a couple other guys that were here. Jari Evans is already on the coaching staff. So it's been 15 years since they won that title. 15 years since they won that Super Bowl title. So it's been a long time since they had one, and feels like it's been a long time since they've had that feeling of contender. So hopefully that can change this year. But I just think, presence of greatness, presence of people that built the culture, that built the winning foundation, that built the new reputation of the New Orleans Saints, because there's a whole generation of fans that this is the worst it's ever gotten is the last 3 years, where you talk to people a certain age, they would have loved to have this be in their down years, but how bad it was for years before 06. So I just think a presence certainly matters, what it takes, accountability, and just knowing a tangible example of this can be possible. So take it all in and take everything in that they're saying. So I think it was a pretty good experience to get those guys here today.
Yeah, Sean, you mentioned how long it's been, the Saints winning that Super Bowl in the 2009 season. I am now 29 years old. I was in the 9th grade during that championship run. So, yeah, it's been a little minute.
I appreciate you making me feel old.
I know, just a little bit. But, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's time for another one. How about that?
Yeah, I know Saints fans would love to see that. And if this pass rush gets right, they figure out that offensive line, that Kubiak system works. Hey, I could see one as an adult. We'll see how that goes. Sean, you got anything left for us?
No, we're winding down here. Only a couple of more days, a couple of more practices. The officials will be out here over the next couple of days. That'll be nice for the Saints. It's been a good experience. They were back in full pads again today. That's like 9 or 10 practices full pads again. 2.5 hours, 14 periods. Derek Carr didn't throw an incompletion today, by the way, so we had a good practice. So, all in all, good experience, but got to finish
Right,
strong.
and you're going to finish your trip strong, I'm sure. You've been on beaches, you've been on yachts. I see you're in the mountains right now, so you've had a time in California.
Yeah, I might need an adjustment period to get my Southeast Louisiana kind of feeling back for the weather, because man, it's like I had an older woman stop me in the lobby yesterday, telling me that man, it's really hot out there today. I'm like, ma'am, I'm from Southeast Louisiana. I'm from New Orleans. We would beg for weather like this right now in Louisiana.
Yeah, when you step off that plane and it's 95 and humid, it's going to be a different feeling.
Yeah.
But good to hear from Saints camp. We've got the preseason game coming up on Sunday. I'm sure you'll hear from us before then as well. But for now, for Andre Johnson Jr., Sean Fazende out in Newport Beach, California, this has been the Fox 8 Overtime Podcast. Please join us again next time on Overtime.